Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this wonderful culmination of the Ramaz Alumni Day of Giving. It's been a really amazing day with responses from all of our alumni spanning our many, many years, and a day of celebration for the entire Ramaz community as we this year celebrate Next Level. And we also celebrate a year where our Principal Emeritus and our Rabbi Emeritus of our community, Rabbi Haskel Lookstein, is celebrating a very, very wonderful milestone, his 90th year and Ramaz's 85th year. And so there's a lot to celebrate throughout. And it's just been a really wonderful beginning of that celebration for Ramaz. And so we are very, very honored to have this evening, the evening that we're focusing on tonight, with Ignorance Cannot Be Bliss, BDS and the University, a new book by Scott Shay, focusing on the new book by Scott Shay, Conspiracy U. Scott Shay, for those of you who haven't had the pleasure of meeting him or spending time with him, is a distinguished leader in the Jewish community and an avid student of religion and its application to the world outside of the synagogue, church, or mosque. These interests are reflected in Conspiracy U, which is his third book. The two previous books, In Good Faith, Questioning Religion and Atheism, and Getting Our Groove Back, How to Energize American Jewry, are books that we do encourage and really will tell everyone that they should be reading and should be on, if it hasn't already been on your bookshelf, it certainly is a book that belongs on everyone's bookshelves. Scott is also very distinguished as having had wonderful, wonderful children at Ramaz, his son Benjamin, class of 2006, and Ariel and Abigail having attended. And so we are very, very proud to have Scott in dialogue this evening with Rabbi Lookstein. In advance, we will have a Q&A at the end of the session this evening, and you can put your questions into the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and we will pose those questions to Scott and to Rabbi Lookstein. We thank all of you for joining. If you have not already made your gift to the alumni campaign, you continue to have that opportunity, and it's an easy link in the emails that have been sent out. Please do join us in supporting the school this year. And again, thank you for joining us for all of the wonderful programming and all of the wonderful things that Ramaz has had the opportunity to do. Rabbi Lookstein. Rabbi, you're on mute. You're on mute, Rabbi.
I'm not used to having to unmute myself. I'm usually absolutely unmuted. Kenny, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this program. It started out originally that I was going to make a presentation on Scott's book, but then it evolved happily into a discussion where I'm going to not be talking so much. I'm just going to be asking a few leading questions, and we'll all have an opportunity to listen to a man who is, I would say, the embodiment of the climax or the climactic words of the Ramaz mission. The Ramaz mission ends with, when I heard the voice of God, this is Isaiah speaking, V'ashmas kol Hashem medaber elai, lemor, et mi eshlach, whom shall I send? Umi yelech lanu, who will go for me? Va'omar, and I said Isaiah, Hineni shlacheni, here I am, send me. This is our hope for Ramaz alumni, that when they hear of a need or a cause or something else that's the word of God speaking to them and saying, for heaven's sakes, I need someone to go for me, that we will answer, Hineni shlacheni, here I am, send me. There is hardly anyone more than Scott Shay who embodies that response to the voice of God. He is the executive chairman and co-founder of Signature Bank. He is one of the foremost leaders and thinkers in UJA Federation, where he has occupied practically every office and is now on the executive committee. But he was chairman of the Commission on Jewish Identity. What's the last word, Scott?
Renewal. I was on the executive committee too.
Okay, renewal. And he did something about identity and renewal. He wrote his book, Getting Our Groove Back, which is a book about the sad facts of American Jewish assimilation and what can be done about it. And Scott not only talks the talk, but he walks the walk. In Congregation Kehillat Jeshurun, he and his wife Susan founded and for many years ran a Jewish Youth Committee, JYC Sunday School, which has accomplished worlds. And he developed it in a certain way and then turned it over to us to run, and is still very much involved and the major funder of it. So he's not just talking, he's walking. He's somebody who thinks deeply and in a visionary fashion about the problems in American Jewish life and Jewish life in Israel. He has 3 books that he's written in the past 15 years. Getting Our Groove Back, which is providing answers to solve the problem of American Jewish assimilation. Whether the answers are working or not working is another issue, but he's tried to answer that issue. And then he wrote this mammoth book, In Good Faith. He spent 5 years writing essentially a book which demonstrates that the Bible can be read as it is. It's, of course, under assault by all kinds of anti-biblical scholars. And he writes the answer to those anti-biblical scholars. It's a fabulous, fabulous book. There's so much in it that Ramaz alumni can appreciate, In Good Faith. And now, I thought after he wrote that book, he would retire to his day job as executive chairman of Signature Bank. No, he spent 2 years. I don't know how he manages to do this. 2 years in writing a book about how his university, Northwestern, where he got a great education, has become a place in which conspiracy theorists about Zionism in an anti-Zionist posture are spewing forth their stuff. And he did a study on what's going on in his university. So my first question, Scott, to you, and you actually do answer this in the book, is why in heaven's name did you write this book?
Well, first, I have to thank you for that amazingly gracious introduction. And I have to say that everything I've learned about trying to retire, I've learned from you. So maybe that's why I keep doing these things. So this book started life actually as a 2,500 word article, is what it was supposed to be for Tablet magazine. Is what I had in mind on lessons I learned from my father. And I had talked to my father a little bit about one professor at Northwestern, Arthur Butts, who was a Holocaust denier. And at least that's what I thought at the time. And in writing the article, I started to basically fall through or jump through the rabbit hole of reading what Arthur Butts actually wrote. And what I discovered is, yes, he's a neo-Nazi. Yes, he hates Jews, but at heart, he claims to be anti-Zionists. He has this theory that a conspiracy theory, the Jews planted thousands of documents to be discovered by accident by investigators, that they convinced innocent, pure, loving German Nazis to confess to crimes against humanity. In his words, they bamboozled them, to confess to witnessing crimes against humanity, to confess to all sorts of things associated with the Holocaust. And that's how devious these Jews were. And they did it all because they wanted to steal money from the Germans and use it to oppress Palestinians and take their land, which actually I found surprising. I thought he was a neo-Nazi, but he claims not to be, claims not to mind Jews, just Zionists. And he has these conspiracy theories about them. And about the same time as I was doing this, a person who made the front pages of some of the New York papers, Professor Stephen Thrasher, currently the Daniel H. Renberg Chair of Social Justice Reporting, gave a commencement speech at NYU that made headlines, made the New York Times headlines and other places, in that he talked about how proud he was of the BDS movement and how they are called upon. He said, we are called upon to boycott and to divest from Israel. And so once I read what he did, I dived into another rabbit hole of reading what he said and what other anti-Zionist theorists on the left said or wrote. And I found, and this is what really shocked me, is the more I read, the more I realized that at a very deep level, they're saying the same thing. Because while Arthur Butts thinks that, Professor Butts thinks that all Jews are conspiring against whites and Germans, Professor Stephen Thrasher thinks that Jews are conspiring with police departments around the world and governments, oppressive governments around the world, to oppress people of color. And so as I started to read more and more and started to study some other professors at Northwestern, I thought, I got to write this book. And it's not a book I really wanted to write. I was ready to take a rest after In Good Faith, to be perfectly honest. But it seemed so urgent to me that I just felt I needed to do it. And once I got to 10,000 words and this article was getting out of control, I said to Susan, I'm 10,000 words. I don't know. This is beyond serializing. And she encouraged me to help to keep going. And ultimately it became this book.
And of course it's called Conspiracy U. Here is the book. On my screen, it looks pretty big. It's actually, compared to In Good Faith, it's a pamphlet. I think In Good Faith runs around 500 pages. This one runs 238 pages.
And it's a bigger font.
A bigger font.
As well.
I think it's slightly bigger font, but in any event, both books are very, very worth reading, but don't try reading them in bed before you fall asleep, because you're going to fall asleep before you really wanted to do that. These are not bedtime readings. These are things to read with a pencil or pen in hand, to underline, to highlight, maybe even to take some notes, because the material in them is very, very useful in all or many roads of life. Specifically, what's a conspiracy theory and how does it differ from a real conspiracy?
So that's a great question. And that I handle at the beginning of the book, because conspiracy theories aren't just at Northwestern. They're sadly endemic in academia today. And There's a huge difference between a theory about a conspiracy. So one could say that someone thinks that A, B, and C murdered D. And if you do, then you need to look at the facts, at the evidence, see if it's possible that there was collusion, and evaluate dispassionately, without regard to whether you like A, B, and C, what they could have done, what their motive was, were they able to do it, what do the documents say, etc. A conspiracy theory is different. So a theory about a conspiracy is provable or disprovable. The problem with the theories on the far left and on the far right in academia, and what also surprised me is there are people on the far right in academia. You can get away with it if it's about Jews. And what surprised me is that academics who should know better write these theories. So when you confront Professor Butts with the problem that there are plenty of documents, as I was referring to before, that show the planning, show the purchase of the Zyklon gas, show evidence of the Wannsee Conference. Well, he just dismisses those as forgeries, as placed by these very clever Jews. So there's always in a conspiracy theory this cabal of moneyed, evil, sometimes multi-generational Jews who are making all of these, who are figuring out how to do evil to poor innocent people, and only a few of the victims, such as a Butts or a Thrasher or others, can figure it out. And Stephen Saleta was one of the people who spoke at Northwestern. He famously was turned on for tenure at University of Illinois, and that's a famous case by itself. But I was struck by something he wrote in a book published, by the way, that was published by Duke University Press, all sorts of academic regalia. And he says something similar to Butts, and I'm just going to quote here. The Nazi Holocaust in Europe seems a direct antecedent to Israel's founding. There were plans from the outset of Zionism to rid the Promised Land of its indigenous population. And then he goes on with all sorts of other stuff. When you read the theories of the far left and the far right, they really come together. There's something close. So the far left, most people on the far left don't have any problem with white people being able to commit atrocities, so they don't excuse the Germans, but some do. And Stephen Saleta and others are a example. But there's a Jasper Puar, Professor Jasper Puar at Rutgers. As a matter of fact, I'm going to be in New Jersey on Thursday night. And this is one of the questions they want to talk about. Is she has a theory, well, Jews send aid to places like Haiti, other places that have problems in natural disasters. So what is the motive? They must be mining organs. Again, alleges it without proof. And it's so, and if you bring any countervailing evidence, it's just that the Jews are so smart. This moneyed cabal of evil people is so smart that they've been able to, again, pull the wool over everybody's eyes. So these theories expand. They expand and expand to the point where they're unfalsifiable. And that's very dangerous, because at that point you can't convince anybody that they're wrong. That's how QAnon thought, said that young children were being abused under a pizzeria in Washington, D.C. It's how Sandy Hook happened. The conspiracies become wider and wider and wider, and the cabal becomes more and more demonized.
Scott, I mean, as you talk about it, and as one reads the book, one immediately thinks of Hitler as a conspiracy theorist in Mein Kampf.
Sure.
I mean, he kind of was a model for some of these people. picking up on the protocols of the elders of Zion, the communists were conspiracy theorists in publicizing the protocols. How does the academic world use conspiracy theory to attack Zionism and Israel?
So one of the things that I point out in the book is that the far right conspiracy theories are almost direct antecedents of Nazi conspiracy theories, and I actually quote Mein Kampf here in a few places. That looks like it came straight that Arthur Butz and others almost adopted. But now with the opening of the Soviet archives, we know for a fact that the Soviet Union created knowingly false conspiracy theories about Jews. And they actually ring to be exactly what you could read today in some modern Marxist far left literature, BDS literature. Here it is. I'll take quoting from the Great Soviet Encyclopedia. The main points of Zionism are militant chauvinism, racism, anti-communism, and anti-Sovietism. The anti-reactionary essence of Zionism is an overt and covert fight against freedom movements. International Zionist organizations own major financial funds, partly through Jewish monopolists. This goes directly, by the way, to the far right side of the Zionist-occupied government, which is what they serve. And here, the Soviets were early, serving as a front squad of colonialism and neo-colonialism. Zionism actively participates in the fight against national liberation movements of the peoples of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Doesn't that all sound familiar? Well, it was written in the 50s, and it's just been rehashed and readopted by far left academics. I mean, it's sad in that they actually don't have a lot more to say in the sense. I mean, these conspiracy theories, they get wider. They take new terms, but I really showed the direct antecedents of this on the far right and again on the far left.
Can you say something, as you do in the book, about how anti-Zionists on the university campus are connected to what many of us see as a woke culture in the universities today? Is there a connection? Maybe not a necessary connection, but nevertheless, in practical terms, is there a connection to wokeism or not?
Well, I would say this. We need to give a lot of credit to the cleverness of the BDS movement. They're really, really smart. I mean, I go into how they get some of these some of the BDS resolutions passed. And they took a page from, frankly, Yasser Arafat, who was great at PR, who linked the Palestinian fight to every other national liberation or left movement. I mean, he really, and I show this a little bit in the book, he really came up with the first PR talking points. And BDS and the anti-Zionist theorists have co-opted every other movement, and they do it partially through conspiracy theories. So just to take another example of Professor Jasper Poor at Rutgers, she's one of the early proponents of pinkwashing. This is the falsehood that Israel has generous laws protecting LGBTQ plus folks because they want to co-opt that movement. It doesn't matter that actually Israel has given asylum very quietly to Palestinians who would otherwise be murdered on the West Bank and in Gaza. because of their sexual orientation. But that doesn't matter, nor does it matter that Israel stopped prosecuting homosexuality in 1953, long before all these academics were even thinking about this as an issue, as a human rights issue. So whatever you say about Jews or Zionists somehow ends up entering, has to be turned around and made into another thing that Zionists oppress. They must oppress feminism. They must oppress LGBTQ rights. They must oppress, and even there's talking points about how Gaza is the example of environmental damage that's causing climate change, even though the 20th largest company in China produces more carbon than all of Gaza. So it's this notion, and they're very smart about it. So if you're for protecting the planet against climate change, you must be against Israel. If you're for feminism, you must be against Israel, and so on and so on. And they do that by shouting out. Intersectionality, exactly. And it was really one of the current originator of a lot of this. Is actually Angela Davis, who links everything. Palestine is Ferguson. That was her book. Everything is about the Palestinians.
When you think about the book that you wrote, and we start as we did, right smack in the middle of it, anti-Zionism, BDS, and the college campus, you sound as an author kind of fierce. But anybody who starts the book knows that you were actually very reluctant to write it. I wonder if you could personalize that and explain a little bit about your own background and why maybe the last thing in the world that you ever thought you would do would be to write a book that essentially is very critical of Northwestern University.
Yeah, there's no question. I really, this wasn't a book I wanted to write. I mean, I say that in the text as well, because I was the first person on either side of my family to go to college. My father was a Holocaust survivor, and he was put into slave labor just before his 14th birthday. My mother hadn't gone to college. Nobody in my mother's side of the family had gone to college. Northwestern was where I'd always wanted to go. I got a great education there at the time. I really loved the education. I loved the environment. When I faced a setback where I almost had to withdraw from the university during the winter quarter of my sophomore year, when my father's business took a sharp southward turn, he was a carpenter contractor. The university came up with money to allow me to continue to be continue to roll. I had no money at that point, really no money. I would have had to go to work. And your
father's payments from the German government
helped to
keep you
in
college.
In college,
something that he never wanted to accept.
That was the part of the reason he accepted them, was so I could go. Not part of the primary reason he accepted reparations, because he didn't feel that whatever he got, I don't remember what it was, at the time. I think it was like $90 a month at the beginning. How does that give him compensation for having his father murdered in front of him, for having his brothers murdered, not killed, murdered, for having losing his aunts, his uncles, his cousins? My closest relative on my father's side is a second cousin once removed. So it wasn't, he sort of thought it was ridiculous, but he was of modest means and he thought he could use the money. He thought the money could be used. He could use the money to help send his son to college. And look, I started giving. I mean, this is a Ramaz giving night. So I will tell you, I started giving to Northwestern the year I graduated, because I was so grateful. I got a good job coming out of college, and I kept giving every year since. But I do think differently about it now, and frankly give differently now to Northwestern. But I'm very grateful to the school. But this needed to be told. It's not just about Northwestern. One of the blurbers said two of the blurbers said I wrote a tough love letter to Northwestern. But I also wrote it to all of academia because it's way beyond Northwestern, and I go through that as well.
There is something in that book. I mean, there was a lot in the book that I didn't know, but one particular subject about which I knew nothing and which I think is obscured in today's world, and I think is going to be a chiddush for everybody who is listening tonight, is the connection between BDS and Morningstar and Sustainalytics and what's called ESG on focused investment strategies. I wonder whether you might be able to explain what I'm talking about, because I think most of the people who are listening to us have no idea.
So I'll do this al regel echad. It's not going to be a full, it's in the book and it's explained more deeply and it's footnoted, which I think is important.
I want
this
you to know
isn't just something
before we made the agreement to have this discussion, I have 2 pages in this book that I was prepared to read to the listening audience, because it's the only way in which I would be able to explain what you're now going to talk about.
So the other reason I wrote this book is because what happens at campus doesn't stay on campus. ESG, environmental social governance, is the new wave of investment. It's the reason that people want to invest not to pollute or to hurt the environment. And this ESG is now permeating all of the investment world. Bloomberg, the Bloomberg organization says there will be $53 trillion invested under ESG governance, under ESG rubrics in the next few years. So companies that used to just look at investments no longer can do that. They have to have this ESG framework put beyond it.
Want to repeat what ESG stands for?
Environmental. So looking at how the company causes harm or not to the environment. Social, and this is important because this is what impacts Israel mostly, and Israel investments, which is human rights, labor relations, and controversies, quote unquote controversies. And then relating to human rights, and then governance, and that's somewhat more traditional. That's boards and appropriate controls. That's okay. Governance is not so controversial, but the social, this ESG, environmental social governance, the only way that folks can deal with this is through a score, because now these days with many thousands of investments, the investment managers can't analyze the carbon footprints or the labor relations of companies. So what they do is they rely on a few firms. One is a prime subsidiary of Morningstar called Sustainalytics. And they also use MSCI and a few others, but the primary one is Sustainalytics and MSCI. Sustainalytics, as part of their framework, has decided to focus on 3 disputed territories in the world. Israel, of course, and because they don't want to single out Israel, because that could lead to bad PR, they also focus on Western Sahara and Tibet. The other 2, Tibet, nobody. Those companies are all on the exchanges of China. It makes no difference. They could replace that with the Principality of Madripoor, and they'd have the same effect. And Western Sahara, not a lot happening there either. But Israel now can get hyper-focused and not be quote unquote singled out. So companies that do business in Israel quickly get bad scores. And these scores are algorithmic. You don't actually see them. On my Bloomberg at the office, there is in the corner of every company's screen a ESG score from Morningstar Sustainalytics. So that lower score, for example, from Caterpillar. Caterpillar, on the one hand, ended up having a huge diesel spill. And they ended up getting a controversy score of 1 for that, which is very low. It's it's the lowest possible score. But for doing business, selling tractors to Israel, they got a 4, and there's generally no 5s. Company after company.
Which is the worst end?
5 is the worst. So you can actually dump into the ocean diesel, and that can be explained away because they have reasons, but selling tractors to Israel can't be explained away. And the sources they use range from Who Profits, Mondoweiss, Danwatch, even in one case, the Iran Daily. So they're using these sources about Israel that hate Israel, that have the desire to destroy Israel, to create as inputs into their algorithms, which ends up lowering the investment, the numerical investment scores for Israeli investments. And this is a quiet boycott of Israel that nobody's talking about because few people understand it. And I break it down in the book. I didn't know this was happening. So I called people. I'm obviously in the investment world. I called people from some of the largest investment organizations in the world that use Sustainalytics. And one senior manager told me he wasn't even aware of this. It's so embedded. Probably everybody on the phone call has some exposure to the to the company of the senior manager I'm talking about, because they're one of the biggies. I called another. They were somewhat aware of the problem, but it's too big and it's not so important. And frankly, in cases, in some of the cases, I'm talking to Jews, and it's just, they don't want to get involved. It's complicated. They would have to explain things. And yet, this is how essentially anti-Semitism, anti-Israelism seeps into the rest of the world in ways that unfortunately are not so clear. I show one advisor, and I'll stop with this. I show one of their advisors who they feature on the Morningstar site. 101 companies she shows, or she says should not merit investment consideration across the world because of their human rights abuses. 59 of them are due to doing business with Israel. So it's a serious problem. And I hope people, and I'll bet there's a number of investment professionals listening to this call, I'd say, even if you don't read the rest of the book, read pages 206 to 212.
And be happy that we have Scott here to talk with me about it, because otherwise I was going to read pages 206 to 212 on this program. And I mean, when I came across this, it was totally new to me. And I have a feeling that it's very much below the radar in the investment world. Maybe people hear about it a little bit, but probably are not aware of how influential it is in terms of directing the investments of individuals and companies and states, where it's much easier to go by a number than to actually go out and do your own investigation and decide what company is good on human rights and which is not good on human rights. So in brief, Scott, what do you think can be done to restore justice, civility, and open discussion on the American university campus about Israel and, frankly, about lots of other things that are today subject to cancel and other kinds of closure. You speak a lot about the golden rule.
Yeah, I think that's what we have to go back to. Evidence-based, the motto of Northwestern, which I use as a sort of an ironic table of contents, really is based on the golden rule. It's about putting the other person in good light, trying to determine what is true, getting good report, accurate report. And yet, unfortunately, when it comes to Jews and Zionists, we're given none of that sort of credit for being a human being. And I give some examples of what I think we need to do. And I think that it's more than just about the Jews. I mean, we're the canaries in the coal mine here. And as Rabbi Sachs, Zichrono Levarcha, said, the hate that begins with Jews never ends with the Jews. And so I think we need to think about this as a broader issue. And I make three suggestions. One is, I think we have to go back to an era where theories can be disproven with facts. When I went to college, people put up a theory and then everybody tried to throw facts at it and take it down. And if the theory stood, good. But if the facts made the theory weak, then that's fine. Now, one academic I spoke to said that she didn't really like facts. Pure theory was pure, but facts are messy. And so we've gotten to the point when theories negate facts. And when we're in that environment, it's not just bad for the university, it's not just bad for the Jews, it's bad for society, because we end up separating to warring factions who can't even talk to each other, because not only don't we just share facts, we don't even care about the facts. So I talk about that a little bit, and I talk about how universities can get back into it, and I suggest a process for that. I also think that students need to be taught in a class the difference between theories, how theories are built, how scholarship has sometimes been abused, and it's not just in America, it's been abused elsewhere. I mean, the first thing the communists and the first thing the Nazis did was take control of the universities. Unfortunately, in the United States, the first thing that's happening is universities are starting out and taking control of the rest of the country. And then I think that foreign donations, even though Jews are held up as this cabal of evil donors, I think that foreign donations to U.S. universities have to be scrutinized. Qatar gives $200 million a year to U.S. universities. It's given more than $500 million to Northwestern University. It's a serious problem. Qatar, of course, supports Hamas, which believes that every Jew from the river to the sea should be exterminated or perhaps expelled. If there were a donor who would also be giving to the Tamil Tigers or to the KKK, I don't think universities would be taking their money. But of course, this is only about the Jews, so it seems okay.
Scott, I want to thank you for opening up my eyes. And just as you did in the book In Good Faith, which anybody who's interested in biblical studies should read that book, because you, Scott, studied the Bible very, very closely. You didn't spend 5 years writing that book. You spent 5 years researching and doing the gut work to enable you to write the book. I suspect that you wrote the book, even though it's a long book, I suspect you wrote the book much more quickly than you did the research on. I know in my own case, my dissertation, the research was about 3 years and the writing of it was about 9 months, which is the right way to produce a book of facts and not just theory, the way you can write off the top of your head. So I want to thank you for what you've done for me personally. And I also want to thank you for what you've done for the world in answering the call of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Es mi eshlach u'mi yelech lanu. Whom shall I send and who will go for me? By the way, one of the things I think that Scott did almost autodidactically is he learned Hebrew very well. And he knows Hebrew very well, and he did not get a Ramaz education. He did not have a real Hebrew education. He learned it actually himself. And it's quite remarkable. But you've arranged for lots of other people to learn it in school. So I want to thank you. I want to open up this now for any questions that people might have.
They can place the questions at the bottom of the page on the Q&A. They can type in questions, and then we can pose them to Scott or to Rabbi Lookstein, please.
Who's in charge of it, Kenny? Leah?
No, I'm following Rabbi the Q&A. So far, nothing is in the Q&A, but as they come in, we'll let you know.
Okay, well, we had a lot of answers. That's the simple issue. If that's the case, then
just give us one more moment to see if anything additionally comes in. But so far, we don't have any questions in the Q&A.
Scott, you know, if this is the case, you're a little bit in Rabbi Soloveitchik's class, because Rabbi Soloveitchik, at the end of a 2-hour shiur, would look at the students and he would say, "You understand me, Val?" And everybody would nod, and there wouldn't be any questions. There weren't too many questions when the Rav taught. Most of us were too busy stenographically writing down what he was saying and then going out. I know I used to do that with my chavrusa, and we would spend another 3 hours trying to figure out what he said and putting it all together. And I used to use my Roman outline that I learned how to do in Ramaz and then in Columbia, and rewrite the Rav shiur in Roman outline.
Wow.
But there weren't too many questions.
Well, now we have a couple of questions. One question came in: what are the alternatives for investment managers short of doing ESG research themselves?
So you could ask, and I've done this, you should need to ask your research firm who they use. And I think this would be helpful, because those that use Morningstar Sustainalytics, you should say that disqualifies them from being your investment manager. Essentially, the rest of the advisors who provide these scores are much more agnostic when it comes to Israel. I don't want to go so far as to say they're pro-Israel, but it's not out there. And their scores, it doesn't impact, for example, MSCI and others. If you talk to the managers, if you talk to the executives, they're just not focused on that. And so really, Morningstar Sustainalytics has to be put on a do not invest list, if you will. And I do not take advice from them list. I think that would be very helpful.
The next question is, what?
I saw one from Harvey Arfa, a written one.
Yes, we have a few more questions that came in, and we'll read that question as well. What are the first steps that we can take to fight this?
Well, I just gave the very first one, which is if you're talking to an investment advisor, say you don't want to have them use Morningstar Sustainalytics, in any way, shape, or form for your investment portfolio, particularly when it comes to ESG. I mean, I think I don't have any opinion on the rest of their investment advice in all candor. I haven't really looked into it. They're probably fine, but you have to say you're not going to do that. And the Morningstar people are quite disingenuous about this. They wrote a paper vindicating themselves for how fair they are, but ignored all the facts. There's a not-for-profit called J-Lens, which examines companies and investments by
How do you spell that?
J and then LENS. And they actually have they have research on this, but they look at companies that fulfill Jewish values in one way or another, and those that don't. And I think we as Jews need to think about this in the same way that Christians and Muslims have do not invest lists that break Sharia law in different ways or charge interest. They don't necessarily invest in banks, whole host of things. There's no reason that we should be endorsing a boycott of Israel. And that's what you're doing when you're following Sustainalytics. I mean, I hate to be that blunt. It's not comfortable, and the Sustainalytics Morningstar people have a script. So I've talked to investment advisors who have called them, and they have a script that they read to everybody. Everybody gets the same answer, that corporately they're not against Israel. But the reality is their Sustainalytics group is very BDS friendly. And I don't know of any other country that they relate to with sources that want to seek the destruction of that country.
There's a question two questions that are both about what advice do you have for Jewish students on college campuses to prepare themselves to advocate for Israel on campus and to avoid being swept up with a great number of other students in supporting BDS in order to fit in with intersectionality?
So there's tremendous pressure on students to fit in. I mean, I can tell you that recently in Northwestern, one student told me that, and I'm talking about students who aren't related to me, the one student said that they were pressured to sign on to a petition that was definitely something that they didn't believe in terms of Zionism and Zionism not being anti-Semitism. Students are under a lot of pressure if they want to be part of progressive organizations, and they're subject to boycott themselves. At NYU, I think it's 58 or 53 organizations said that they would not permit anyone who was pro-Israel to be a member of the organization. So I actually think that the rest of us have to take up the mantle. It's actually not totally fair to our students to say that you have to be the tip of the sword. I think we have to be the tip of the sword. And I talked to a group of Northwestern parents recently who actually were, in this case, I got, some of them were, I think, annoyed with me because I was besmirching the campus. They're paying a lot of tuition. They certainly don't really want to talk to the university. When the BDS resolution was proposed at Northwestern that I talk about a little bit in the book, I spoke to four trustees who were Jewish, and they really preferred being a trustee of Northwestern to defending Israel and defending the students. I mean, I was really taken aback. It was just, I go into a little more detail in the book. I've talked to one Jewish chairman of a top 20 university who's Jewish, whose campus had a lot of BDS activity going on. And I said, clearly this person is in a position of power. But again, that person prefers to be the chairman of the board of trustees of that well-known university that probably some people are applying to, or children are applying to, are on this call. So what in a way, I have to say this, and this hurts to say, what has bothered me in some ways more than the vociferousness of the people who hate Israel is the apathy of Jews and people who should be allies of the Jews who should know better. And that has been really distressing to me. I don't know how to sugarcoat that. I think we need to be the tip of the spear.
Well, I want to interject here. I'm glad you're getting all these questions, and I'm very moved by your answer. But the last paragraph of my book, where We Are Brothers Keepers, the public response of American Jews to the Holocaust, 1938 to 1944, goes essentially.
I'm going to pull it down from my shelf if I can.
It goes essentially like this. The Holocaust could not have been unstoppable by American Jews. It wasn't perpetrated by us or by Americans. It was perpetrated by the Nazis across the sea. It was not unstoppable by us, but it should have been unbearable for us. And it wasn't. And that's very clear in my research. And you're saying the same thing. I think we have learned the lesson of the Holocaust, and Jews are much more active and responsive, but not all Jews and not in all cases. And you mentioned that for some of us, it's more important to be in the right place and at the right time than to do the right thing. There were many Jews in Roosevelt's inner circle. They were all in the right place at the right time, and they didn't do the right thing. Mm-hmm. It's easy to see that in retrospect, but here we are 75 years later, and in a different set of circumstances, and where the stakes are not quite as high as they were during the Holocaust. Nevertheless, some of us are bystanders instead of activists.
100%. This is stoppable. And by the way, the thing that does concern me, I'm not a apocalyptic, catastrophic Jew, so I don't want to overstate what I'm about to say. But conspiracy theories are really dangerous toward the victims, because they're usually politically motivated. And there were plenty of conspiracy theories in Europe that made the Holocaust easier for the populations to accept. There were conspiracy theories about the Hutu power movement against the Tutsis that prepared the populace for action against the Tutsis. The Turkish, pre-World War I, started a whole bunch of conspiracy theories about Armenians that sound actually a lot like anti-Jewish conspiracy theories. So these are dangerous. And again, I don't think the United States is Germany. I don't think it's Europe. But I think it's not, for people who want to say this is about a pendulum, what I worry is that it's a tipping point. And again, not as bad. We could become like the Jews of the UK, which are just, try to keep to themselves a little more. But nonetheless, it's stoppable now. It is stoppable if we give it sufficient effort. And that's a good part of why I wrote the book. But the first thing is recognizing what's out there. And I bring chapter and verse in the book of what is out there. And that's, I think, important.
One of the things that you can do is read this book, because what Scott was just talking about is absolutely written about in the book. How bad conspiracy theories can be and what they set up in terms of behavior, irrational behavior by supposedly rational people.
Scott, Rabbi Lookstein, this has been not just informative, but very eye-opening for many of us. And it sounds like it's actually a must-read for any of our students also going on to college campuses, as it is for any parents sending their children, as it is probably for everyone in our community. Thank you for enlightening us this evening, for sharing with us. Rabbi, thank you for putting this together with us. Once again, I remind everyone that this is the culmination of our Alumni Day of Giving. We had a wonderful happening towards the very end of the day, which is that a very generous alumnus of the school made available to us a match. In honor of Rabbi Lookstein's 90th birthday, this alumnus will be matching up to $18,000 of additional gifts. So please consider making your gift if you have not already done so. It's been a wonderful day of giving for the school. A lot of outstanding things are happening in all areas of Ramaz today, and our entire community, whether you be an alumni parent, a grandparent, a community member, you know that the wonderful things that are happening in the school continue from the tradition and from the legacy that Rabbi Lookstein and his father before him have set, and we are trying to sustain it into the future. So as we say, we're at the next level and we're rising together, and we look forward to everyone being there alongside us. Scott Shay, thank you. Rabbi Lookstein, thank you. Wishing everyone a wonderful night.